the ruins of Hattusa sit quietly in the hills of central Turkey. Broken walls, collapsed gates, weathered stones scattered across dry grass and mountain wind. At first glance, it feels more like the remains of a forgotten frontier town than the heart of a lost superpower. But 3,000 years ago, this city was the center of one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, an empire strong enough to challenge Egypt itself. The Hittites controlled trade routes, mountain passes, armies and kingdoms across the Near East. They mastered diplomacy as skillfully as warfare. They fought one of the largest chariot battles in history against Ramesses II. They signed peace treaties that still survive today, and then they nearly vanished. Not destroyed in one dramatic collapse like Rome, not preserved in towering monuments like Egypt. Instead, they faded slowly. Their language disappeared, their temples collapsed, their capital burned and was abandoned. Their archives vanished beneath the earth. For centuries, historians were not even certain the Hittites had existed on the scale described in ancient texts. They became little more than a name in the Bible, a shadow. That is what makes the Hittites so fascinating. They were not a minor kingdom lost to time. They were one of the great powers of the Bronze Age, a civilization that stood beside Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. For centuries, the Hittites were almost completely forgotten. Their cities reduced to ruins, their language lost, their empire buried beneath the hills of Anatolia. And yet somehow this civilization had once stood beside Egypt as one of the great powers of the Bronze Age world. So how does an empire powerful enough to rival the pharaohs of ancient Egypt disappear so completely that history itself nearly forgets it existed? And could our own civilization someday suffer the same fate? The Hittites rose in one of the most difficult regions of the ancient world, Anatolia, the rugged highlands of modern-day Turkey. Mountainous, fragmented, cold in winter and dry in summer, a land of cliffs, valleys, forests, and narrow passes where movement was slow and power had to be defended constantly. This was not Egypt or Mesopotamia. There was no Nile or Euphrates binding the land together. No predictable river valley capable of supporting massive centralized populations with ease. In Anatolia, survival was harder. Cities remained isolated by terrain. Roads were dangerous. Kingdoms were separated by mountains and distance. Power here had to be built differently, defended hill by hill, road by road, fortress by fortress. The Hittites were not the first people in Anatolia. They entered a land already filled with older cultures, languages, and religious traditions, but instead of erasing what came before, they absorbed much of it. Their empire became a mixture of peoples and beliefs. Hittite, Hattian, Hurrian, Luwian, and others whose influence survived through ritual, language, and law. Their gods came from many cultures. Their ceremonies preserved older traditions. Their scribes recorded multiple languages across clay tablets stored inside royal archives. In many ways, the Hittite Empire became a reflection of Anatolia itself, complex, layered, adaptable, and that adaptability became one of their greatest strengths. The Hittites learned to survive in a landscape where nothing came easily. They became practical, resilient, disciplined, warriors when necessary, diplomats when possible, record keepers when stability mattered more than conquest. And from those mountain strongholds, the Hittites slowly expanded outward. But first, they needed a capital strong enough to control it all. And the city they built would become one of the great fortified capitals of the Bronze Age world. At the center of Hittite power stood Hattusa, a capital unlike any other in the Bronze Age. Built into rocky ridges and steep hills, the city looked less like a ceremonial center and more like a fortress designed for survival. Massive defensive walls followed the shape of the land itself. Monumental gates were guarded by carved lions, sphinxes, and warriors frozen in stone. The walls and gates of Hattusa were not built for ceremony. They were built to defend the empire from rival kingdoms, raiders from the north, and rebellions constantly threatening the fragile Bronze Age world. Temples, palaces, granaries, and royal buildings filled the city behind its defenses. But perhaps the most important structures inside Hattusa were not its walls, they were its archives. Thousands of clay tablets recorded laws, treaties, rituals, military orders, diplomatic correspondence, and royal decrees. The Hittites understood that power was not maintained through military strength alone, but through administration, memory, records, communication. An empire cannot function if it cannot organize itself, and the Hittites were remarkably organized for their time. Their kings were not simply military rulers. They were also religious figures responsible for maintaining order between the human world and the divine. Politics and religion were deeply connected. A famine could be interpreted as divine anger. A military defeat might signal ritual failure. Treaties invoked gods as witnesses. Loyalty was not only political, it was sacred. It was through this culture of religion, diplomacy, administration, and adaptation that the Hittites transformed themselves into one of the great military powers of the Late Bronze Age. Their influence stretched deep into Syria. Their armies moved across trade routes and frontier kingdoms, and eventually, their growing power forced a confrontation with the most famous civilization of the ancient world, Egypt. The clash came in Syria, the strategic crossroads between the Hittite Empire and Egyptian influence in the ancient Near East. In the 13th century BC, thousands of chariots clashed across the plains of Syria. Dust clouds swallowed the battlefield. Confusion spread through both armies as messengers raced between units trying to communicate commands. Formations shattered under ambush and chaos. This was the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. Then the dust settled. The armies withdrew. Not a decisive victory, a draw. And for perhaps the first time in the ancient world, Egypt had encountered an empire it could not simply conquer. Egyptian monuments later portrayed Ramesses II as a triumphant hero. But reality was more complicated. The Hittites survived. Their empire remained powerful. Their influence in Syria endured. And that alone revealed something extraordinary. Egypt could fight the Hittites, but Egypt could not destroy them. Kadesh may have been the largest confrontation between the two superpowers, but it was not the last. After years of warfare, the Hittites and Egyptians signed one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in human history. Not because either side was weak, but because both sides understood the cost of endless war. Copies of the treaty still survive today, carved into Egyptian temple walls and preserved on clay tablets recovered from Hattusa. One replica even hangs inside the United Nations headquarters as a symbol of one of humanity's earliest surviving peace agreements, and it reveals something important about the Hittites. They were not simply warriors, they were diplomats, strategists, administrators, a civilization sophisticated enough to manage alliances, marriage politics, trade systems, and vassal states across enormous distances. At their height, they stood beside Egypt as equals, one of the true superpowers of the Late Bronze Age. But powerful civilizations often appear strongest shortly before they begin to fracture. Because while the Hittites stood at the height of their power, the world around them was beginning to collapse. No empire lasts forever, and the Hittites lived inside a world more fragile than it appeared. The Late Bronze Age was deeply interconnected. Trade routes linked kingdoms across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Tin and copper moved across enormous distances. Grain shipments fed cities. Diplomats carried messages between courts. Armies protected roads, ports, and frontier territories. For centuries, this interconnected system created wealth and stability across the great empires of the Bronze Age world. Then it began to fail. Around the late 13th and early 12th centuries, cities across the Bronze Age world started to burn. Mycenaean kingdoms collapsed in Greece. Trade routes across the Eastern Mediterranean broke apart. Major cities in the Levant were destroyed. Entire political systems unraveled. Historians still debate exactly why. There was no single catastrophe, no single invasion. Instead, the collapse seems to have come from many pressures arriving at once. Climate stress, famine, migration, economic instability, internal rebellion, war, the slow breakdown of interconnected systems that had once held the ancient world together. The Hittites were especially vulnerable. Their empire stretched across difficult terrain. Their authority depended on supply lines, communication, and loyal vassal kingdoms, and as instability spread, cracks began to appear. There are hints of desperation in the surviving records, concerns about grain, military pressure along the borders, a growing sense that the empire was straining beneath forces it could no longer fully control. Then came the end. Exactly why Hattusa was abandoned remains unclear. Food shortages, climate stress, political instability, collapsing trade networks, and external attacks may all have played a role. What is clear is that the centralized Hittite Empire could no longer sustain itself. Hattusa was abandoned, then burned. The image feels haunting even now. A city built to project permanence, massive gates, fortified walls, royal archives, temples once filled with ritual and ceremony, suddenly silent, then destroyed. Not erased from the earth in one dramatic moment, but removed from the living world. The Hittite Empire did not shrink into a smaller surviving kingdom. Its central power collapsed completely. Some populations likely dispersed into smaller regional communities and successor states across Anatolia and northern Syria. But the great imperial capital of Hattusa was never fully rebuilt, and over time, memory of the empire faded with it. That may be the most unsettling part of all, because the Hittites had once stood beside Egypt as equals. Yet while Egypt survived in monuments and stone, the Hittites slowly disappeared into obscurity, their language unread, their archives buried, their capital reduced to ruins sleeping beneath the Anatolian hills, a superpower lost beneath the earth. Forgetting rarely happens all at once. Usually it happens slowly. A road is abandoned, a temple collapses, a language disappears, a city becomes ruins, then dust, then legend. The Hittites were never fully erased. Their names survived in fragments of ancient texts written by their enemies, but for centuries, almost nobody understood who they truly were. Were they a small kingdom, a minor people exaggerated by history? The idea that the Hittites had once ruled one of the great empires of the Bronze Age was almost forgotten entirely. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Hattusa. What they uncovered changed ancient history. Buried beneath collapsed walls and burned stone were thousands of clay tablets waiting in silence for more than 3,000 years. Treaties, laws, royal correspondence, religious rituals, military orders. The ordinary records of an empire suddenly speaking again. Decades after the first tablets were uncovered from the ruins of Hattusa, scholars in the early 20th century finally deciphered the Hittite language, allowing an empire silent for more than 3,000 years to speak in its own voice once again. The silent ruins of Hattusa began to reveal something astonishing. The discoveries at Hattusa revealed that the Bronze Age world had been far more interconnected than most people had ever imagined. The Hittites sat near the center of that world. To the south stood Egypt. To the east rose Babylon and Assyria. To the west lay the Aegean world and the Mycenaean Greeks. To the north stretched the Black Sea frontiers and the tribal peoples beyond them. Trade routes, diplomacy, war, migration, and religion connected these civilizations across enormous distances. And at the center of many of those connections stood the Hittites. And in the rugged mountains of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, those connections made a civilization as powerful as the Hittites possible. And slowly, a lost civilization returned from the dark, not through legend, but through the very clay tablets that had once made Hattusa one of the great powers of the ancient world. Today, the walls of Hattusa are no longer defended by soldiers. Metal scanners now welcome tourists through the ancient gates. The temples and record rooms no longer hold royal archives filled with clay tablets. but archaeologists still study those ruins to this day, uncovering new pieces of the Hittite story from beneath the Anatolian soil. And with each new discovery, the lost empire becomes a little clearer. But the Hittites leave behind more than history. They leave behind a warning. The Hittite Empire depended on an interconnected world. Trade routes, diplomacy, supply networks, communication between distant kingdoms. And when those systems began to fail, one of the great superpowers of the Bronze Age began to collapse with them. Cities were abandoned, then burned. Their language disappeared, their customs faded. And for nearly 3,000 years, the empire itself was almost forgotten. As we look around the modern world, that warning feels strangely familiar. Our world is even more interconnected than theirs. Massive cargo ships carry food, oil, electronics, and raw materials across oceans every day. Aircraft cross continents in hours. Supply chains link nations together across thousands of miles. And we already see how fragile those systems can be. Oil prices rise with conflict in the Middle East. Food insecurity spreads when grain exports are disrupted. Economic shocks ripple across continents in days. So perhaps the world has not changed as much as we like to believe, because beneath modern technology and global trade, civilizations still depend on fragile systems holding together under constant pressure. And so we have to ask ourselves, how many disruptions would it take for our world to face the same fate, for our great cities to fall silent, to collapse beneath the earth, to remain buried for thousands of years, waiting for future civilizations to remember them once again?